Hey folks, this is David from the Coachville Coaching Leadership Podcast. I have a quick favor to ask you before we get started. If you haven't subscribed or followed on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or the podcast platform of your choice, please do so. I would love your feedback. In every show note, in every episode, there is a link to rate this podcast. So it's ratethispodcast.com/Coachville Coaching. I want to make content that's good for you and better for all of us. All right, on to the show now. All right, folks, we're back to the Coachville Coaching Leadership Podcast. I'm David, and today I'm here with Richard Lee Tai. Richard, how's it going today?
It's going great. Thanks for having me on your podcast.
All right, Richard. You are a connection consultant.
Yes.
And you are an advocate of social health. Can you explain to everyone what you do and what all that means?
Yeah, that's a good question because people may have never heard of the term connection consultant or social health before. I know I certainly didn't when I was growing up. What it really means is how can we promote connection in our daily lives? Connection became something that was important to me because I grew up feeling quite shy and lonely. And so I never had any classes on like, here's how you make friends and here's how you communicate effectively. And so I feel like the result is so many people just try their best to figure that out. And in my case, I had moved from my hometown to go to a different city for university. And I needed to start from scratch because I didn't know anyone there in that new location. And for the first couple of months, I would say I was feeling quite homesick and out of place and lonely. And it's this particular experience where I was physically surrounded by people because I was living in residence, I was in lecture halls of hundreds of people, but still feeling like all those connections were surface level, were just small talk, and it wasn't the same depth of relationships I had back at home. And so that got me thinking of like, how do I fix this? How can I address this? And one thing I realized is that there's this gap of education, and therefore there's stigma. There's shame attached to me admitting, like, hey, I don't have very many friends in this new place, even though that's completely understandable. And that's probably the case for other people too when they move to a new city or start a new job or have any sort of transition. And so the nature of my work now as a connection consultant is how can we make these meaningful connections easier? And how can we normalize discussion of this? Because it's so crucial for our overall fulfillment in life. The term social health, what that means is it's the well-being that comes from our connection and community. So just like there's physical health and there's mental health, there's also social health. And I think it is worth distinguishing that topic because we don't talk about it enough. I know at one point mental health was a taboo topic too, that we kept hidden away. People didn't openly share about it. But nowadays, at least there's a term. It's part of our common conversations. What if that was the case for social health too? That we check in like, how are you feeling? Like, what's your level of connection right now? And different domains of your life too. So that's why I'm a social health advocate, because it's important for the rest of our life. And there's lots of research that backs it up too, that having these great connections is the key indicator to having a healthy and happy life. So yeah, that's sort of in a nutshell what a connection consultant we help to make connections and promote social health.
So I'm curious, like, thank you for sharing that story of like moving into residence, moving into a new town.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people can relate to that, Richard, right?
Mm-hmm.
I am curious though, like, why now? Why is connection so important now? And why is it so important now to drive this awareness?
Yeah. I guess I'll start with the preface that I feel like it's always been important, but perhaps it's more pressing now, especially after the pandemic when so many people experienced loneliness and isolation. And technology, I think, does play an influence as well. Just talking about my subjective experience, I know when I was in university, social media really warped my perception of things because I would see my friends posting about the parties and events they're going to, and then I'm just sitting home alone. So that made me feel more lonely. because I had this false perception of what was actually going on, because we just choose to present a very small sliver or one side of our life on social media. It's not our whole self. So I think with the pandemic and with the continuing rise of technology, this is the time to talk about this because there's and there's more and more research around this too. For example, I live in Canada, so there's a survey done in 2021 called the Canadian Social Connection Survey, and they found that nearly 50% of all Canadians reported feeling lonely. So that might be an alarming number to you, that might not be, but it just showcases that so many people are experiencing it. So let's talk about it, because it's a completely addressable issue in my opinion. Even in the US, the Surgeon General a few months ago, they released the public a public advisory on our epidemic of loneliness. So you can consider its own epidemic too. So I guess with all that, it's like the issue, our need for connection. We're wired for connection. It's always been there, but I think it's just more important than ever to actually address it, because so many people are suffering silently, I would say, when that doesn't need to be the case. When there can be more people, like if I had someone growing up or even in university that just sort of, talked explicitly to me like, you might feel lonely and that's okay, I think that would have done so much to make me feel more grounded, and not feel like something was wrong with me, because there wasn't anything wrong with me. It's just that this topic's not discussed enough.
Yeah. You mentioned social media and the ill effects of that. It gives a pretty warped image of what reality actually is of a person's life. It only shows the best days or the best parts of the day of any individual's life. And I know what you're talking about. I actually, believe it or not, I actually disconnected from all social media during the pandemic. That's in 2020 hit. I actually made a choice. I deleted all my accounts, everything, and I chose not to connect in that way, but actually, in the best way possible in 2020 was to actually connect with people, even through Zoom and whatnot. Actually, I wish I started a podcast at that time. That would have been a great time. But I guess just when I look at what you do, Richard, and the value of it, like bringing awareness to loneliness. You say your mission, like I was looking at your profile on your website, it says making meaningful connections easier.
Yes.
So how do you do that? Making meaningful connections easier.
Yeah, great question. As a bit of context too, when David's referring to my website, I had a chance to deliver a TEDx talk about 2 years ago in my city. And so that gave me the opportunity of like, okay, what's the one key message I want to share with the world? Because it's going to be out there online for the rest of time. And what I came upon was I realized connection's always been the common thread in my life. And more specifically, how to find excuses to connect, which is the title of my talk. It's like, what are these different ways that we can take an active role in designing the environment or designing the parameters so it makes it easier for us to interact with people? And so, for instance, I am a big fan of a card game called We're Not Really Strangers. And how that game works is each of the cards have a question on them, and it's meant to facilitate conversation. And so for me to ask a friend or even a stranger, it's like, hey, I have this fun card game to get to know each other better. Do you want to play? That is an excuse to connect, because it's framed as a game. It makes people generally like more open to it. It's more lighthearted, even though because I play the game many times, I know it results in meaningful conversations and discussions. So yeah, I that's an example of an excuse to connect. So how do you make meaningful connections easier? The simple answer is you can find these excuses to connect with people. I see David's pulled up my website now. But
and for the folks who are just listening, excuses to connect.com.
Yeah.
So that's your website, making meaningful connections easier.
Yeah, thank you so much. And that has one of my TEDx photos on there too. So that's from my talk.
Yeah. And I think you sort of skipped over that very, very humbly, Richard. You're a TEDx speaker.
Yeah.
And I think you might have. Do you have a goal of being a TED speaker as well?
Maybe. I do know people that have done multiple TEDx talks, so I'm like, I could do it because, to be honest, a lot has changed with me, and I've improved a lot with my public speaking skills ever since I did my TEDx talk. So, to be honest, when I look back at it, I'm like, oh, I could have said this differently. I could have, but I think that's just the side of growth for anyone, that we look back on our past work and sometimes it's a bit embarrassing. I'm like, oh, I could have done better, but I guess that's the chance where I can do a second TEDx talk, and I have a pretty good idea of what I would talk about in the second talk. So
Oh, what would it be about?
yeah, so a phrase that is important to me is "I thought of you." So these four words seem quite simple, but really it's powerful in practice, because the phrase "I thought of you" symbolizes the connection between two people. And I can be both the recipient and the giver of that. So I'll start with the recipient side, where if someone reaches out to me and they say, like, oh, Richard, I came across this book or article about connection and I thought of you and wanted to send this to you, that makes me feel nice, because it's like I was in their mind and they intentionally reached out to share something that they thought I would enjoy. Um, I've also had it in the context of, hey, Richard, I saw this job posting around community development. And because I know you're a connector, I think you'd be a perfect fit for this. You're the first person that came to my mind.
Hmm.
So it's, I didn't ask for it. It's not like I was intentionally looking for it, but it feels so nice to have, opportunities come to me because of who
Hmm.
I am and for people thinking of me. So all that to say, it's like it makes my day or it makes my week when I receive a message like that. Thinking about that, it's like you can be the giver of that phrase too. I thought of you. So to think of the people in your life, of what are their goals, what are their challenges right now, and what are resources or connections or other things that you can send their way, to say it similarly, like, hey, I saw this opportunity and I thought of you and I wanted to share it. It can make their day too. So like this simple phrase, again, I thought of you, and now that you've heard it and listeners are hearing it, it's like, start paying attention to it in your daily conversations of where it actually comes up, because it comes up quite frequently, and I think it's a tool that we can actually leverage a lot more by using it thoughtfully. um I guess pun intended, using I thought of you thoughtfully.
Yeah.
um so yeah, that's what my second TEDx talk would center on.
Yeah. It's amazing you talk about that. Just the other day, one of my siblings, she actually sent me a message early in the morning
Hmm.
saying, "Hey, I was making, she was baking some sort of baked goods. She loves to bake,
Yeah.
and she's like, "Hey, this whatever she was making, I thought of you."
Yeah.
That's all she said. I thought of you this morning because I was making this, and that was it. That was her message. I was like, "Oh, hey,
Hmm.
good morning." And
Yeah.
to start your day like that with one of your, family members saying, "Hey, I thought of you when I was making this." And now I'm not surprised. Anything to do with food, they thought of me, probably, right? There's
Yeah.
there's there's a many to one correlation there in my
Right.
world. But it does make your day, because back to your theme around loneliness.
Hmm.
Like, I wasn't lonely, but it I felt a connection there.
Yep.
I felt
Yeah.
connection, and like there's a bond that I have with that person that I know was
Yeah.
there, but it felt stronger for that moment.
Hmm.
Okay, so Richard, like, how do you help then? Like, you've done TEDx talks.
Yeah.
You're planning to do another one. You do consulting in this area. I guess, who do you help and how do you help?
Yeah. Yeah. Great question. Yeah, because more specifically, what it is that I do, I would say two of my main focuses right now are in professional speaking, so in the form of keynotes and workshops and trainings, and also when it comes to consulting. So I'll give you just a concrete example. This was a full circle moment. So it was really cool. But I had a chance to have a consulting contract at the university that I graduated from. So the one where I was feeling lonely at the first place. And the nature of this contract was that after the pandemic, they noticed that lots of students, of course, their mental health was struggling, but also
Mm-hmm.
they're just staying in the rooms. They're not really going out to events. They're having difficulty making friends. People would finish classes and just go home. So campus did feel quite dead compared to pre-pandemic, even though
Mm-hmm.
enrollment didn't drop that much. So they were trying to find a way to address these different challenges, but in a proactive, preventative approach. Because there are students that access counseling services, for example, but for most of them, I would say students are accessing it because they're in a crisis. uh, which is great that they're still able to access something, but what if we had a more upstream approach where we can try to like cultivate resiliency and well-being earlier on so people never get to that emergency type of situation. So
Mm-hmm.
all this culminated in this idea of the rec room, which stands for refresh, energize, and connect. But basically, it's these different play spaces we had on campus where we bought like ping pong tables and giant chess sets and board games and puzzles as a way of connection through play. So having a chance to take a break from your classes and just have fun and meet new people. And so I had the opportunity to help launch and monitor that program and do some research and create a report about how that was going. So really the nature of my focus of my work right now is really around post-secondary institutions of universities and colleges, because I was there not that long ago and I still know what it's,
Mm-hmm.
if anything, perhaps it's even worse because I was, I had my whole undergraduate experience before the pandemic started, but students nowadays they're struggling. I would say so. It's a huge issue, but I think also addressable. So that's what sort of consulting looked like. But I also do like these one-off workshops, whether it's for staff or student leaders or just the general student population, to educate people on that. Because I said like people didn't grow up with a class of here's how to make friends. So here's a class on how to make friends. Like I don't quite frame it that way, but sort of like here's
Yeah.
connection 101, or like here's how to connect with anyone, and just unpacking this, like what are the actual barriers to connecting. Because I commonly hear advice of like just put yourself out there more, which I don't think is very helpful, because it's not that people don't know what to do. It's similar to like with exercise or like diet and that sort of stuff. Like we know what to do. It's just how do we do it? What's getting in our way of actually putting ourselves out there? So yeah, getting to the root of here's the common fears you might be experiencing, here's how to overcome them and practice it still, because it's a skill. It's literally in the name, it's social skills. So it's like a muscle
Mm-hmm.
you can still exercise and get better at. So delivering those workshops to educate people and get them starting to think about this too, because I never received anything like that growing up.
So when you're running these workshops, who
Yep.
what kind of like I guess like what kind of folks are attending these workshops, right? Like
Yeah.
how would you describe them, right? Number one, and then number two is what are some common techniques? Like
Right.
here's the thing, I thought I'm pretty extroverted by nature, and just
Mm-hmm.
how I grew up personally, but you know, truth be told, there's some things that I learned, as a teenager and in my younger years. Hey,
Yep.
actually, it's not that cool to connect that way, right? There are better ways of socially connecting. So just because
Yeah.
you're extroverted doesn't mean
Right.
you're really good at connecting with people. You can actually be
Yeah.
rubbing people the wrong way. So
Yeah.
I guess, what kind of people would, attend these workshops? And
Yep.
then what are some examples of ways to better connect with people?
Yeah, for sure. Good question. So for example, I delivered a workshop to some graduate students and postdoctoral fellows at a university here in my city. And the reason I was brought in is because the staff were saying, like, okay, so these graduate students and postdocs, they're very bright. Like, they're like experts in their fields, like they're great with their academics and research, but also they're in a very insular environment where sort of their whole life is revolving around their academic work. And so when
Hmm.
it then comes to, okay, I'm graduating or I'm looking for a job in industry, how do I bridge that gap? Because it's not necessarily what you know, it's also about who you know too. So in that context, they wanted to bring me in to help bridge that Yeah. So, I mean, the
Mm.
people in attendance were, and this is the case, I think, if you take any segment of the population, it's like there's all sorts of people. There's introverts, there's extroverts, there are people that feel more socially confident and people that feel less. But I still feel like there's a starting point for all of us in terms of meeting them where they're at. And so one of the practical tools that I provide to people that actually I learned from my therapist, so credit to her, but this idea of a fear ladder. And this is something I talk about in my TEDx talk too, but the idea that imagine there's a ladder and there's 10 different rungs. And so each rung corresponds to a different level of fear. So from a scale of 1 to 10, if I tell someone, for example, just approach a random stranger on the street and start a conversation, that might be a 9 or a 10 on their fear ladder because it's just so out there for them that this is too much of a leap of faith for them to actually take action. It's too daunting and intimidating.
Mm-hmm.
But if instead I ask someone, well, what's your 1 out of 10 on your fear ladder? What's something that's slightly outside of your comfort zone, but still feels doable? And then what you can do is you practice that behavior enough until that expands your comfort zone. And then you can move on to like, what's your 2 out of 10? What's your 3 out of 10? So it gives a structured way of approaching this that meets people where they're at. Because for instance, like someone has told me like their 1 out of 10 would be messaging one of their friends and asking them if they can go for coffee. Because they already have an existing relationship, they know that's very unlikely to be rejected, and but it's still practicing that skill of outreach. So
Mm-hmm.
fear ladder is one concept that I teach to people. Another one is this tying back to the idea of I thought of you. I have what I called my like connection equation. So it's thinking plus thanking equals connecting. So this idea of
Mm-hmm.
being thoughtful of those people around you, and how can you express gratitude and appreciation too? Because unfortunately, I think we do live in a society that we might not hear that acknowledgement enough for our good work,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's in a workplace or with our friendships or our family life, to actually hear that we're being recognized for who we are and what we do. So this connection equation, how people utilize it's like I thought of you and wanted to say thanks. So um, how I get people to implement that idea in our workshops is like think of someone in your life that's made an impact on you, whether large or small, and write a thank you letter to them. To actually think about, like without you, I would not, for example, be in the job position I am today, or without you, I wouldn't be as confident or whatever it is. So for them to spend a few minutes writing that letter, and then I give them an opportunity to deliver it. And like, it's great that you reflected on all, but think of the person receiving this like just out of the blue one day of like, here's the impact you've made on my life and here's why I appreciate you. They're probably going to keep that letter forever, or like a special
Yeah.
place to remind themselves. So I tell people like, if you can hand deliver it, great. If you can take a photo of it and email it or message it to that person, great. But what I do during my sessions, because I write a letter as well, I pick someone in my life, I call them live during the session to read out my letter to them, because I think there's just something different about verbally communicating it. And it's always, I had a mishap before where I called someone and they didn't pick up, and then she texted me right afterwards like, Richard, I'm in the washer right now. I'm like, oh, that's bad timing.
Not an
But that's okay.
excuse. Not an excuse there.
Yeah, but it's always so meaningful because it really, the point I make to them is like, okay, this whole exercise took let's say like 10 minutes total of like writing the letter and like calling this person. And it was so meaningful. Like there's been many times where I'm reading out my letter and I get emotional too, and the other person gets emotional just for them to actually hear how much they mean to me. Because
Yeah.
taking to the extreme, it's like, I would say we often wait until it's too late to express our
Mm-hmm.
gratitude and appreciation. Like you think of funerals and the eulogies that people deliver, but really that individual's not there to hear them anymore. So what if we had that appreciation sooner and more regularly in our day-to-day life? Because it can help deepen our connection so much just to think of those people in our life and express our gratitude and appreciation to them. So just to summarize, so fear ladder is gives you a like practical framework of where you could start wherever you're at, and then this connection equation of thinking and thanking as well.
That's wonderful, Richard. Thank you. I you remind me of something that happened to me just very recently, where
Yeah.
someone actually wrote me a letter. Like, here's the thing: being in leadership, that's my day job,
Right.
and it's like being in customer service in some ways. It's thankless. You're giving, you're giving, you're giving.
Yeah.
You only hear about the crap, and you know when something happens, something bad happens. But occasionally you get a thank you from someone. And I got a thank you from someone recently. And it was a very
Mm.
heartfelt thank you from someone I respect. And I kept that. I kept that letter. And
Yeah.
I didn't tear up. I was trying really hard. No, but in all seriousness, it nearly brought a tear to my eye because,
Yeah.
you know, they talked about how I helped them.
Right.
And, the last few years, like, this is what you did for me. This is where I struggled. Here's how you helped me. Thank you. I wouldn't be here without your help. And
Yeah.
it was very touching. And those are the letters you're just keeping it forever. It's so powerful when someone says
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So I actually, funny you mentioned that. I have I started a Google Drive folder called like my celebration folder. So whenever I receive like a really email message or even a handwritten note that like describes the impact and appreciation they have for me,
Mhm.
I screenshot it, I put it into this folder because just like everyone else, we have those down days where we doubt ourselves or really self-critical or like all that, and it's like, okay, well, let me just look at this folder just to remind myself of the impact that I have made on other people. So yeah, it's great that you're keeping that letter that person gifted
Yeah.
to you.
So you bring up a good point. I saw on your socials that you
Mm-hmm.
celebrated a celebration of life so far.
Yeah, yeah,
Celebration of life so far for Richard Lee Ty.
yeah.
So for context, maybe just for the people listening to this
Uh-huh.
podcast, what was that? It
Yeah,
seemed like a birthday, but it wasn't a birthday. I was kind of like, what's going on
yeah,
here? But help me understand. But I think I know
yeah,
where it's going now.
for sure. Yeah, I guess I'll start with, this is a very me thing to do. I don't think most people celebrate their birthdays this way, but it's authentic to me. But I guess I'll start with last year. I did something unique for my birthday as well. And just to say, like, up until this point, birthdays have just been sort of whatever. It's just like another day, I
Yeah,
have some
it
cake.
is. It
So,
is.
but I
Yep.
wanted to do something more intentional and creative, especially now, like I was more embodying this identity of being a connector. So I'm like, okay, a birthday is an excuse to connect. It's a way to bring people together. So let's utilize it. So last year I did blindfolded conversations. So people knew what they're signing up for, but the idea that I got people together, they put on blindfolds, and then I paired them up and then gave them some conversation prompts to have a chat. But the whole idea is that, you're not judging based on people's appearances. You have to be really present and listening, and, getting themselves outside of their comfort zone a little bit too. But of course, at the end, you can take off your blindfold and see who you're chatting with. And everyone said it was quite a positive experience. So that's sort of the context we're starting from. So I already did something unique last year. I'm like, okay, this year for my birthday, for listeners too, I turned 25, so I'm still quite young. But I'm like, okay, this is a milestone. This is a quarter of my life. So I wanted to do something significant for that too. So I was playing around with different ideas over like the past few months, and I landed on this idea of celebration of life. I know it's a
Mhm.
term. Well, I was Googling it because I know it's a term that's used as an alternative ceremony to a funeral. But I thought, okay, well, can we have an intentional opportunity to celebrate the fullness of life and all that it has to offer? So that's why I added the so far component, because I'm like, I'm not dead yet, and I want to be very clear, this is not like a living funeral. It's like, I'm celebration of life so far. And part of my concept for this too is I have a few friends that are doing multi-year or lifelong projects. For example, one of my friends, he says he's going to do a marathon every year until he's 65.
Mhm.
Or one of my friends hosts an annual event for entrepreneurs, and he said he's going to do it for 55 years. So he's on year 8 of 55 right now. So I wanted also for my birthday event, my birthday, to mark year 1 of some multi-year or lifelong project. So on my event page for this, I'm like, okay, let's assume I live to 100, which I don't think I'm gonna get that far, but like that's 75 years. So this can be year one of 75 of me hosting this annual tradition. And I really do want it to be a tradition. Like, yes, it's on my birthday, and yes, part of it's to celebrate me, but can we celebrate life in general? Because part of what I did at my event, I asked people, it's like, hey, do you want to give like a 3-4 minute speech about what do you want to celebrate about your life this past year? We also did this exercise of writing a letter to our future self. So a year from now. So I have all those letters. And so it functions as a time capsule. So next year, if they come back to the event, I'll give them back their letter. If not, I'll email it back out to them. We also did this activity with balloons. So as you may tell now from people who are listening it, like I care a lot about play and creativity and finding like different innovative excuses to connect. So I got this idea from a friend of using balloons. So the idea is, so people get a slip of paper and I gave them 3 questions for them to answer on that paper. So it was, what is it, what's something that you've done in your life that you're really proud of? It doesn't necessarily need to be this past year, but like in general. What's something that's still on your bucket list, whether it's going on an adventure, having certain experiences, or even like reconciling with certain people in your life that maybe you've lost touch with or there's conflict? And also, how would your life be different if you knew you only had 1 year left to live? Because part of my event too, like, even though it's still a celebratory tone, I did want to allude or recognize like this element of death, where appreciating our mortality is like, I assume I'm going to live a long time, but who knows, really? And I think when we know we have limited time, it puts things into perspective where things that we worry about or think are a big deal maybe aren't that big of a deal. And we wouldn't be caring about 5-10 years from now. And also helps us to really hone in on what really does matter to us. So that's why I asked this question too, of like, you had a year left to live, how would that change things for you? So anyway, people wrote all the answers on the piece of paper, and then you fold it up and you stick it into the balloon. And then you inflate the balloon and tie it off. And so at the end, we had all this whole pile of colorful balloons. And I tell people, like, this is an analogy where, you know, the balloon can pop at any time. It's sort of like the fragility of our life too. And we did do that. So on the count of 3, we all popped our balloons at the same time. And you could read the note that's inside because it's from someone else, and then you find that person and have a conversation with them. So all that to say, like, the whole event was quite structured in terms of there's a series of concepts or activities I wanted to take people through. And yeah, so this is, I told everyone's like, you're my guinea pigs. You're the first iteration of this, and it's going to evolve over time. But yeah, that's what I did as my celebration of life so far. And this is year 1 of 75 of me hosting this. And I did it online and in person. So David, you could
That's
come
awesome.
to the online version.
I would welcome that if you would have me. It's what I love about this too is you're using the occasion of your birthday as a way of helping others understand like the concept of like acknowledging death is not a bad thing. And I've talked about it on this podcast before. Like countries like Bhutan, the happiest country in the world is Bhutan. And one of the reasons why is because they talk about death all the time. It's part of the culture there. And so when people think about it, it's like, well, if I was gone today, would this matter? Whatever it might be. Like, oh, someone cut in front of me in traffic, whatever it might be. And so naturally you're going to be happier because you know, like it doesn't really matter. These little things that are annoying you, or hey, I want to get a promotion, or I want to be rich. It doesn't really matter. You know? So I think you're doing a great service there to folks. And I mean, yes, if you invite me, I will come.
I'll remind you. I'll set. There's a bunch of people who are invited who couldn't make it this year. I'm like, okay, I'm still hosting this for 74 years. I'm sure you'll catch one of them.
74 years.
But no, it's appreciating our mortality and impermanence, because it's. I will say I had some doubts about hosting this event because I'm like, is this controversial? Is this sensitive? But at the very least, I think it's countercultural, because in Western society, I think there is a tendency to avoid discussing death or keeping it very far away, or seen as a morbid or
Yeah.
depressing subject, when it's not necessarily how all cultures around the world treat it. As you're saying, like in Bhutan, or I think of in Mexico, they have their Day of their Dead. So
Hmm.
literally an annual celebration to honor their ancestors and celebrate. So yeah, it's like, let's we can think about this in our daily life, because we can't really take our status or wealth with us uh,
Nope.
when we're on our deathbed. So it's yeah, sometimes it's good to sort of visualize or project into the future of like, okay, well, at the end of my life, what stories do I want to be able to tell? Will Have I lived a life without regrets? Because that's
Hmm.
one of my big focuses, is like, I don't want to, be thinking of like all the things I didn't do, or things that I should have done but never took the step to. So like, let's do it now. I still have the opportunity to do so.
I asked you a question for before the podcast about if there's anything you've changed your mind about lately or doubled down on, and you
Yeah.
talk about the concept of reparenting. So
Uh-huh.
you say it's the process refers to giving yourself what you didn't receive as a child.
Yes.
Can you talk more about that?
Yes, for sure. So reparenting, yeah, maybe came across it 2, 3 years ago in like the therapy context. But this idea that we all still have an inner child within us, even if we're adults. We might have just locked that part of ourselves away or buried it deep into under all these different layers of adult responsibilities. But our child's still there. And the thing is, like, I'm learning more and more that our childhood has such a large bearing on how we act and how we think as an adult. And unless we consciously take the time to examine that and question it, then we might still be operating from the same conclusions we've drawn from childhood. So I know for me, a large part of my personal development journey was like unlearning people pleasing and unlearning perfectionism and unlearning this idea that my self worth is tied with my performance. Because I guess sort of stereotypically, I heard that all the time growing up in an Asian household. You might be able to relate, but it's like, like I need to achieve certain grades or get certain rewards or get into a certain job, then I am good enough. Then I can receive praise and validation from people. So because
Mhm.
I had that belief in my mind, what really resulted is like I never felt like I was good enough. It's all conditional and temporary. So even when I did achieve something, it's such a fleeting sense of happiness, and then my mind's already on to the next thing of like, what's the next mountain I need to climb. So had to unlearn that of like, what if I could just have inherent self-worth that's not determined by external factors. So this whole process of reparenting is examining like, well, what is it, and recognizing too, like, our parents aren't perfect. Like, they try the best with what they know, and in all cases, there's still going to be something that they haven't provided for us fully, whether that's affection or security or acknowledgement. So we as adults still have an opportunity to be the parent to our inner child. We can self reparent. So it's that's the concept there. And I would say, to tie it in with the different themes we've been chatting about so far, a big one for me of reparenting is celebrating myself, because that's not something that came naturally to me. I never heard stuff
Mhm.
like, oh, good job, Richard. I'm so proud of you. Of course, my parents express their love in different ways, but never through those words of affirmation.
Mhm.
So celebration was literally a foreign concept to me. I had to ask myself, like, what is celebration? How do I do it? So it's been an intentional practice ever since then, like actually acknowledging myself at the end of the day, for example, like, you did a good job today, Richard, and you can be
Mhm.
happy with this and you can be proud of this. And of course, hosting this birthday event, the celebration of life, was a really, like, of course, is for other people, but there's a selfish element there to like, this is a way for me to celebrate myself in a very intentional way. So celebration is one, and the other key theme I would say in my reparenting journey right now is around rest and play. I realized, I mean, I think it's a case for a lot of immigrants, but both my parents are immigrants. They had to work extremely hard to reestablish themselves in a new environment, and
Mhm.
things were unstable for a long time. And so they worked really hard. But because I saw that, what I had consciously or unconsciously internalized, like, oh, I need to work really hard too. Because I never really
Yeah.
saw them, intentionally going out to have fun and just rest and play. So I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, well, I don't deserve that either. So it's something now as an adult I need to examine. Like, okay, I never quite received that as a child, but now I can. It's important for me to give that. It's like, it's just, I went to a paint night event this past weekend. I'm like, why not? It's like I haven't done painting since I was a child, but it's like this is just for fun for me, just to cultivate my
Yeah.
inner child. So
I
yeah,
was
that's
just
the concept of reparenting for folks that don't
reparenting.
know. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's great. It's a lot of it sounds like it's about being kind to yourself too,
Mm-hmm.
kinder than how you might have been raised, right? And
Right.
taking responsibility for that
Yeah.
too, right?
Yeah.
Um, it there's a podcast, I can't remember which one I listened to recently, where the individual there was talking about, like, we always talk about good work ethic, but we never talk about having a good rest ethic that
Mm-hmm.
goes with that.
Yeah.
And in order to have good work, you got to have good rest as well, right?
Yes.
Um, the other thing that came to mind is that you talk about Asian cultures. There's some irony there where you're, on one hand, you're taught to hustle all the time and work hard all the
Mm-hmm.
time. You don't deserve the rest. Yet in the Taoist philosophy, the yin and yang, it's all
Yeah.
about balance. If
Right.
you work hard, you got to also rest hard as well. You got to have
Yes.
the balance in life. So there's some irony in even the cultures and what they
Mm-hmm.
say and what they manifest out there. So,
Yeah.
so Richard, given all this, right, everything you're doing, with some wonderful work you're doing for the world, in my opinion, you're helping people connect with others. You're finding excuses to connect, helping people understand how to do that. What's next for you?
Yeah. Great question. It's been a journey. I've been telling a lot of people, it's like I feel like being in your like the 20s, like that decade, is probably one of the most transformative periods of your life, because who you enter in when you're 20 and who you leave when you're 30 is quite different, because there's so many new experiences that occur during that time, whether it's being an adult for the first time, moving out, going to school if you choose to go to school, starting your career. So it's all a big adventure for me. I guess one answer I can give is, when I turned 25, I also had this idea of like, what are 25 goals I might have for the next quarter of my life? Doesn't necessarily mean I'll achieve all of them, but it just give me some orientation to direct my energy and efforts. So I have a few. I'll share one or two of them. One of them, I do want to travel to Vietnam. Those are where my parents are from, and I was born and raised in Canada. So I've still actually never had a chance to visit yet, and I know I have some family members there. So I think that's an important part of my personal journey, just to see where my parents grew up and have a better understanding of that.
Mm-hmm.
Also, I like traveling in general, just to be able to meet people and experience different cultures. So that's one. Um, I also have this idea. I want to spend like a 2 week stay at a Zen monastery. I'm like, this would really take myself out of my, normal pace of life and just put myself in a new,
Are these the
unfamiliar
silence ones
environment.
where you got to be silent for 2 weeks?
We wouldn't be silent necessarily for the whole 2 weeks, but yeah, I mean, there is a lot of meditation, but conversations too, listening to talks, having discussions. So, but yeah, I would have to, of course, fall into their schedule, whether it's like waking up at 6 a.m. and then like doing all this stuff. So it'd be outside of my comfort zone, but that's something I do want to do. So yeah, still lots of like life goals and experiences I want to engage with. And of course, I know connection's going to be always there, because it's just a central part of who I am. And there's always more stuff I'm learning, and it's interdisciplinary by nature. So there's always more to engage with. But yeah, I guess one other way I can orient this to of what's next for me, or what I'm continuing to do, is I would feel fulfilled in life if I have made great memories with great people. So that's something I keep in the forefront of my mind too, in everything that I do. It's like, how am I creating memories with great people? So whether that
Mm-hmm.
is just through my personal life or through like more formally through my work too. Yeah, creating these experiences for people. So yeah, I'm creating great memories with you, David, on this podcast.
Well, thank you very much. It's time always flies doing
Yes.
this podcast when you're talking to great people. Like, I'm looking at the time closely. I'm very conscious of your
Yes,
time and the listeners' time. So I could go. I always tell folks I can go another hour if we if
same.
yeah, we can go another hour. But let me end it with two more questions. And I
Okay.
always ask these two questions to every guest. The first one is, what advice would you give to the teenage Richard?
Uh, yes. So this is great because this sort of ties into reparenting as well. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I think something that's become more and more evident to me recently is just this idea of like accepting who I am. I think when we're teenagers, there can be a really lost feeling of like, who am I? Where do I fit in? Who are my people? What are my values? Um, and I think I was definitely feeling that especially around the idea of like, what do you want to do with your life? Like, what do you want to do after high school? That's like big question. Like, I don't think any 18 or 19-year-old really has a clear idea of like
Mm-hmm.
what is it they're gonna study, and it's not the be all end all. But just telling my younger self, like, you know, you're cool, Richard. You're a badass. Like you could accept and celebrate who you are and just let your light shine through. Because again, like more and more now, I'm like my celebration of life so far event. I knew some people wouldn't get it, but I know there's people that are gonna understand it too. And it's like no one else is probably ever going to do this, but I want to do it, so let's do it. So it's just
Mm-hmm.
leaning more and more into that. It's like, you have unique gifts and perspective on the world, and just do it. Just express yourself that way. It doesn't matter if it looks a bit weird or it's different than what other people are doing.
Yeah, it's yours.
Yeah.
It's who you are. All right. Well, Richard, I always leave the last question to my guest to ask me any question that you wish. Try to stump me if you want. And I'll just use the edit button here later to edit it out if I can't answer the question.
Yeah.
So, what's
Oh,
your question to
okay.
me?
Oh, there's so many questions I can ask. I should have prepared for this.
I
Um,
purposely don't tell you.
that's fair. Um, okay, this comes to mind. I'm sure, like, people experience this all the time. It's like, after you have a conversation, then like, and you reflect back. I was like, oh shoot, I should have asked this instead, or should have said this instead. But this is okay. Um, this is sort of meta, but I will ask you, what's the biggest question in your life that you're trying to answer?
Biggest question in my life that I'm trying to answer. Recently, how would I want to be remembered?
Mm. Mm-hmm.
So, everything that you talked about today, celebration of life so far, conceptualizing more like the impermanence of mortality. Um, uh, I'm a little bit older than you,
Yes.
so so two, a little more than 2 decades older, and I could tell you the thought processes, the journey. Um, it evolves. It's just what you had as a teenager asking those questions. It happens in every decade. It's just
Yep.
different
Yep.
questions that you'll have depending on
Mm-hmm.
your experiences. And so, I do ask, like, where I am now in my life, in my career. I've worked hard to get to where I am. I asked a question a few years ago. What do I truly want to be remembered for? Right. And the answer came to me years ago, right before the pandemic. One of my colleagues, he was retiring for the second or third time, right? And I say second or third
Mm-hmm.
time because this gentleman, he's been on my podcast, very well respected individual. He's been through a number of things in his life. His first wife passed away, due to sickness,
Yeah.
but he's been resilient. And when you look at his retirement that I went to right before the pandemic, the number of people who went there to celebrate you know, his retirement was amazing. And it was not about, oh, this is so and so's title. This was his title. This is, oh my God, he was an SVP or EVP. No one cared.
Yeah.
Everybody had a story about this is how he impacted my career. Every single person. And
Yeah.
and the funny thing, when you hear about this individual, and I know one guy who used to go to airports, and travel with him. He would bump into people at airports, people with gray hair and everything. It's like, oh, so-and-so, you know what this guy did for me in my career? And there's just story after story after story of that.
Yeah.
And it was at that moment 3 years ago when I said, I want to be that. My version of that.
Yeah.
And that being people saying, hey, Dave helped me in my life, my career. He helped me achieve what I wanted to achieve. And that actually freed me from the pursuit of titles, the pursuit of, I never cared for the money per se. I always believe that if you do good work and, you vouch for yourself, the money will come. It's not about the money. But a lot of people, chase promotions and money, and it was chasing impact, right? Chasing that impact when I retire. So that's a long-winded way of telling you. That's the question. It's still evolving. What do I want to be remembered for? That's what it is right now, right?
Yeah.
The guy who actually changed people's lives and helped them achieve what they wanted to. And I think that's why coaching is another vehicle for me to do that.
Yeah.
Like both of us attended the same coaching academy, Canada Coach Academy. Shout out to Natalie Blais, who was also on one of my podcasts.
Yes.
So it's another vehicle to help me get there. So just like yourself, Richard, I'm on a journey. I'm still on a journey. I hope this journey goes on for another, years, a few more decades.
Yep.
I love it. So that's me in a nutshell, Richard.
Great. No, I thank you for answering that question. Yeah, it's great how it just wraps up the whole theme of the podcast too, of like how do you want to be remembered, what legacy or impact you want to have on others, and it's like about those stories of appreciation.
It's the stories.
Connection. Yep.
Yeah, and that's all that really matters at the end of the day. So, well, Richard Lee Tai, thank you, sir, for your time today. Anything else you want to say to the crowd out there?
Oh yeah. For people who are listening to this, I always say this at the end of when I'm a guest on podcasts. Like, you've listened to this episode now. You can use this as an excuse to connect with me, because I always love to hear back from people of like, oh, you could say like, oh, I was listening to David's podcast and I liked when you said this. So anyone that's listening, just want to give that open invite. It's like, I'd love to connect with you further, whether it's just for chatting or if you have collaboration opportunities in mind. But just love connecting with people, obviously. So this is your excuse to connect, is what I'll say.
All right. Well, we'll share all your contact details, your socials, everything in the show notes. And when I post this out there, please repost as well, Richard.
Yes.
All right, sir. You have a good day. Thank you for your time.
Okay, you too.
And